Welcome to the Beyond the Horizons podcast, where we delve into some of the key topics that came out of the 2024 MSP Horizons report, produced in conjunction with Canalys. The report noted that increasingly MSPs are being asked to manage more of the compliance efforts of their customers in everything from public regulation to cyber insurance and sustainability to simple software compliance. In this episode, I'm joined by Charles Weaver, CEO of MSPAlliance, as we look at how some MSPs are turning compliance into a business opportunity and some of the potential implications of the growing market for compliance as a service. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Horizons podcast. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Charles Weaver, CEO of MSPAlliance. Thank you for joining us, Charles.
Pleasure, Pete.
And so can you let's just kind of start off a little bit. You can tell our viewers and listeners sort of about yourself, but also particularly about MSPAlliance.
Absolutely. I'm one of the co-founders of MSPAlliance. We started, believe it or not, 24 years ago, at the height of the first, what we thought was the first wave of managed services frenzy, but it certainly wasn't going to be the last. And we started with about 5 core members at that time, and grew to today we're well over 30,000 members globally. Chiefly what we do today is act as a standards body. So we developed an MSP organizational control framework in 2004. So still fairly early on in the professional history of the MSP space. Today we certify MSP organizations all over the world on 5 continents. We do, however, play a significant role in terms of policy. We're not a lobbying group by any means, but we do remain quite active in legislative public policy issues, all relating obviously to MSPs, either directly or indirectly.
Mm-hmm. So you guys, I mean, before we get started, obviously, I mean, so you guys have seen a huge change in the landscape really over the last, as you say, 24, 25 years.
Well, I look back and I think to myself, in the 2001, 2002 era, I never really, I had doubts that MSPs would remain, would be in it for the long haul. And maybe I shouldn't have thought that, but everything was so, if you recall, the dot-com era was very chaotic, and it didn't exactly land peacefully, right? It was a very abrupt cliff that we went over. And out of that came a lot of MSPs who had grown up in the mid to late 90s, who had done quite well in the enterprise. And then companies such as the one you work for, Enable, were groundbreaking for bringing the enterprise MSP tool set down to the mid-market and SMB layer. And that, I think, really was a boost in the arm for value-added resellers and MSPs who wanted better tools to do what they do. And I think that revitalized a lot of the momentum that we then saw in the mid to late 2000s.
Mm-hmm. And obviously that kind of, and again, talking about that changing landscape, I mean, obviously what we're going to be talking about today is very much focused on compliance and regulation, and that you're sort of uniquely kind of positioned really to be able to kind of look at that with a long-term perspective as well, both from what you've seen coming and with your experience, kind of, I suppose, where things are going as well.
I think you just called me an old man, Pete. That's fine. Yeah.
Well, I think unfortunately, I think fortunately, unfortunately, I think we both fall into that category these days. So,
I will accept that, and I do look at it with a fair amount of privilege of having lived through a lot of this, and being able to say to especially younger MSPs, there's a path for you to follow. You don't have to do this the hard way, because I remember a lot of very early MSPs, a lot of them Enable partners, who had to forge a path through very uncharted waters. They did not we were all making up the rules, so to speak, in those early days, and so that wasn't a good time. It was exciting at the time, but today I would rather have the comfort of being a new MSP and say, okay, what do I need to do? Well, there's a path forward. Many thousands of MSPs have taken it before me. That's less scary, less risky, and a much better future, I would think.
Mm, mm. So yeah, so directing it, let's get into the meat of what I kind of wanted to talk to you about today. Which so we obviously we did the MSP Horizons report last year, which we did in conjunction with Canalis, and one of the things that came out of that is that MSPs. A lot of those MSPs responding noted that they're increasingly being asked to manage more and more of the compliance efforts of their customers in everything from public regulation to cyber insurance, sustainability, even simple software compliance. So, is this is compliance now becoming a big business opportunity for MSPs?
Pete, I think that what you found in that study was a reflection of the evolving need of the MSP to move away from the view of compliance that we've had maybe for about 15, 20 years, which is it's more of a bureaucratic, it's more of a red tape type of procedural thing that you must do in order to maintain or achieve a customer relationship, right? For
Mm,
example, in banking, right? Whether it's in the UK, whether it's in US, Canada, and many other places, there are fairly well established rules for how do those banks operate, and particularly how do they operate with an outsourced IT department called an MSP.
mm,
And so you would get certified and or audited, and then you would have the assurance to give to that banking client that you're qualified. That was the old school way of compliance, and it still exists, mind you. Banking here in the States, we have this massive bureaucratic monstrosity called CMMC, which is
mm,
making its way throughout the defense industrial base, and that is causing a lot of change, a lot of self reflection amongst customers and MSPs about what types of process and controls are taking place in their relationship. But your study, I believe, uncovered the revenue opportunity, the upside,
mm,
which is you had mentioned insurance. So
mm,
at the onset, slightly before, but at the onset certainly of the pandemic, we saw a tremendous increase in activity amongst MSPs helping a client fill out a cyber insurance renewal form. That was relatively new and fast,
mm,
very sudden behavioral change. And then we started to hear MSPs charging for that service. And I would say they found themselves perhaps unwittingly right in the center of the compliance discussion. And from there, it evolves and is evolving into other areas of corporate risk, corporate governance, all things squarely in the wheelhouse of what we call compliance.
mm, 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 mm. And you mentioned cyber and liability insurance is something of a it's almost like a completely separate conversation because there's so much going on in there. But are you seeing this kind of take up across other forms of regulation as well, other forms of kind of compliance areas of compliance also within different industries as well?
Certainly. So I would say that whether it is the UK Cyber Essentials in
Mm,
your country, which is very akin to what the Australians are doing, which is very
mm,
akin to what the US and the Canadians are doing. GDPR was a forerunner, not on the cybersecurity side. I would say more on the data privacy side, but that's a separate issue. Yes, I would say that there are now decidedly all major developed countries around the world are acting on the general issue of cyber, are
mm,
acting on the knowledge that they're at least at the enterprise below enterprise level, mid market and SMB, that they are dealing with a entity called the MSP because they have outsourced and handling the internal IT function of all of these compliant or covered entities, and so there is a very fast learning um, ramp, if you whatever you want to call it, of these non technical people and entities coming into very fast um, understanding that the MSP is a critical player in the
Mm,
role of protecting these different service market verticals, and they're not going to go anywhere. You can't remove them. To remove them would be catastrophically dangerous
mm,
and reckless. And
mm,
so they're having to come to grips with the MSP as a proxy for the internal IT department for whom they represent. And
mm.
that is, quite frankly, what we've been waiting for
Yeah,
30 years.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I think you when in our initial kind of conversation leading up to this, you kind of, I suppose, raised this concept of compliance as a service, and that there are increasingly there are the sort of more, I suppose, more tools coming onto the market that can that feed into this concept for MSPs and can help them to keep their customer environments compliant. So let's talk a little bit more about that concept of compliance of a service for a little bit.
Whether you call it compliance as a service, I think most MSPs that I talk to, I would say that they are comfortable in calling it something like a VCIO, VCISO service, which is a pre-existing,
Mm,
um, maybe more of a consultative arm, but they're certainly already familiar with that concept.
mm,
And but yes, you're right. There have been a lot of tools. The GRC tools have been around for decades, right?
mm,
Is starting at the enterprise level, but they're now filtering down once more to the mid market and SMB. The I think there's been some confusion amongst MSPs who look at compliance as a service to be delivered to a client rather than a symbiotic relationship between the MSP and the customer. And that is
sure.
where I think we could get into some amount of trouble, which is to say that the MSP who believes that they are irrelevant to
Mm,
their client's compliance story would be and is catastrophic. That is decidedly not what the policy makers, the legislators globally that we know and are talking to,
mm,
that's not how they view things. And I'll give you a great example in the CMMC analogy I gave before. Here in the States, with the Department of Defense and the defense industrial base, right? So all of
mm,
the disparate entities, public and private, who serve the industrial machine here. Um, that scheme, that control framework, looks at the end user, right? The defense industrial base end user client,
mm.
the same way almost that they look at their MSP,
Yeah.
which is you are both implicated. You are both
Mm,
responsible for the controls that are flowing down this stream. I look at it as a stream or a river,
mm,
and the MSP cannot extract themselves from that stream. They are part of it.
mm,
They are part of the supply chain managed services stream, if you will. And to look at it in any other way would be to um, would be catastrophic. It would be
mm,
incorrect, in my opinion, and it would lessen the value of the MSP, which I don't think they want to do. I think that compliance as a service, as you put it, and many others put it, makes the case quite strongly for the deep trusted advisor relationship that we all
mm.
know MSPs have with their clients.
Mm, mm, mm. So yeah, there was a point you kind of made earlier about the sort of confusion around that. Do you think in a way that using this term as compliance as a service, we are potentially getting into that area, which we do with a lot of things, is coming up with almost like marketing buzzwords, to create something that becomes almost like a saleable object, And by doing that, or commoditizing basically, is I suppose what I'm trying to say, but in a more direct way, by coming up with the concept of compliance of a service, we're attempting to commoditize that, but also therefore at the same time slightly confusing the market.
You're not wrong, Pete, and I won't disagree with you that there could be a certain amount of commoditization around compliance or the GRC tools that are looking at the MSP, and this tells it all for me.
Mm,
They predominantly look at the MSP not how Enable would look at its partners. You would look at your partners as a very symbiotic
mm,
relationship. I know this because I know your company quite well over the years.
yeah.
I've watched you as a company
Mm,
grow, and I know how deep the relationship is between Enable and its MSP partners. The GRC tools largely look at MSPs as resellers,
mm,
and there's nothing wrong with being a reseller, but that's not what MSPs historically have strived to become.
mm,
And so to look at it just as a reseller tool where the MSP is giving or using a tool for a customer to say, let's map your controls.
mm,
Well, historically, for at least a small medium business, if they did that exercise with a small organization, they would find that probably 50% or more of those controls are actually influenced by the MSP themselves.
right.
So if you follow that through to its logical conclusion, and you're playing the role of overseer or public policy or legislator, you then have to ask yourself, well, we now must swing the spotlight to the MSP to see
Mm,
how they are secure and cyber resilient and making sure that they are safe for that constituent client base. And
mm,
that and so and on, and that's where I
mm.
think we are focused at MSP Alliance. And that I can't speak for other you know organizations out there, but that certainly is what we find ourselves addressing most every day.
One of the things for me, I suppose, is I think potentially there is a downside that when, you know, uh, with this focus on kind of tools and the sort of compliance as a service, do you think we're getting to a stage where we can make, certainly with things like cyber insurance, do you think we're making it potentially even more of a checkbox mentality than it currently is, or is there a danger of going that way? And if there is, how do we kind of, I suppose, avert that sort of like avert it from going down purely a checkbox kind of mentality?
Pete, that's a conversation best had over a pint, I would say. That's such a deep question that I can't I can't answer it very quickly, but I'll
Mm,
attempt to.
mm,
There are MSPs that I've talked to who are completely fine with a future where compliance is a checkbox.
mm,
I would say that, and there are others that are not. And I'll
mm,
give you the checkbox approach has some advantage in that it is easy to understand. It's easy to understand. Doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to fulfill or to accomplish, because that means bureaucracy typically, and
mm,
checkbox bureaucracy is not necessarily something that the MSPs I think would favor.
mm,
The non checkbox approach would, and here's the argument that I've been presented with, which is the MSPs want a seat at the table when it comes to the governance of their profession, and I
mm,
can respect that.
mm,
I think the MSPs have waited long enough and worked hard enough to earn their positions of trust
mm,
to have a non MSP group or a non MSP entity attempt to regulate them.
mm,
The insurance companies, I think, are going to do anything that will help them move more product,
mm,
more insurance subscriptions, and I think we're in discussions with a handful of vendors who are understanding of that, and they understand that to move more insurance, they have to have a keen understanding of what risk the MSPs present.
mm,
Put slightly differently,
mm,
they have to prove the theory correct that MSPs actually lower risk, not
mm,
increase risk.
mm.
My belief, probably your belief
Yeah.
as well, but I think that's where we need to go. Um, it's a big topic, and insurance,
Mm.
as you know, is quite regulated globally. So I would prefer regulation not to seep into managed services. I would prefer check the box compliance not to become completely check the box. I would
Mm,
like to have a little bit more latitude personally.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, again, it's kind of like it was a question I wanted to ask to kind of see where you were going with that, and I realised that yeah, we probably could have dedicated an entire 40 minutes to just talking about that as a concept. Um, but so it's about not almost like off that as well is like, do you think that compliance as we get kind of deeper into the compliance landscape, do you think this is likely to drive a kind of greater focus, greater vertical focus for MSPs? And by that, I mean, do you think that really, it's kind of, if you know that you're compliant within one set of kind of industry regulations, the MSPs are going to think, well, I'll specialize with that. I know where I am with that, and that I'll build my client base around that. Or do you see that kind of not really being an issue?
It could. It
Mm,
could actually play out exactly the way you see it, which is not historically any different than how MSPs behaved in the late 90s or early 2000s, which is to say that I knew MSPs that were very deeply involved in the banking or security vertical, even back then. And their understanding and compliance as a service wasn't even a concept. They were not filling
mm,
out, regulatory forms for their customers or cyber insurance forms for their customers. But they were aware of things such as banking regulation. They were aware of the unique pressure elements of those clients and what they had to do in order to alleviate them, and therefore they could apply that across
mm,
on a scalable one-to-many basis, as MSPs do, to anyone in that sector. Same with healthcare. Healthcare is a great example of a heavily compliant, heavily regulated sector, both here in the States, Canada,
mm,
in UK. And there are many MSPs who have done quite well in the healthcare vertical, and yet haven't had to do anything close to what we're what they're having to do in the CMMC world, which is actually go through certification, actually
mm,
demonstrate controls, transparency, process, procedure. That never really reared its head in the healthcare sector. So it could play out the way you suggest, but I think that there's also a likelihood that it has an opposite effect, and I'll explain briefly.
mm,
There are now MSPs, your enable partners, who are taking their certification and their knowledge of certification and compliance and applying general cyber frameworks, including some that have no certification. So it's just a
mm,
framework. There's no oversight concept involved, and they're trying to level set their managed services customers and upskill
mm,
them to a level point of cyber hygiene or cyber preparedness. And I
mm,
think that that's a far greater role for the everyday MSP is be involved in your vertical market. Yes, I'm
mm,
not saying that.
mm,
Don't do that. What I'm saying is go beyond that. Don't
mm,
just be comfortable with your vertical market customers. Also go to the where you are the general practitioner for that customer, and pay as much attention to them as you would to your vertical customer.
mm,
If that makes
mm.
sense.
Mm. Yeah, it does, and it kind of touches on something, the question that was kind of starting to form in my head as you were talking anyway, which is the idea that you know you, you established what I suppose would be a highest common denominator. So if you as an MSP know that you are compliant to the toughest of regulations, or at least the toughest of regulations of which you're likely to come into contact with. I mean, it may be that you don't necessarily think you're never going to work for the federal government, for example. So maybe there isn't necessarily the need or the sort of the budget really to achieve that level of compliance. compliance, and but if you can achieve, and we talk about, yes, we do talk about this with our own partners, and with that idea of getting their customers to a, as you say, a specific level, so that everybody's at the same level. And if you raise that bar as high as you can do, so obviously, we're going highest common denominator rather than lowest common denominator. Then effectively you are creating a solid baseline, which enables you to kind of, a solid baseline to work from, and to move into different industries, and to still know that you've got that basic level of compliance in place, that if then, for example, you did then get to a stage where you're going, oh damn, you know what, I've got a federal government client here, well, it's a relatively small step to then take your own compliance up a level. Are we seeing, are you seeing that happening? Is that kind of where you were going with this?
I would describe what you just articulated, Pete, as this is my term, not anyone else's. I call it managed services immunity.
Mm,
And it is the concept that if you are demonstrating proper cyber hygiene, proper
mm,
MSP operational behavior as an MSP, and you are also allowing, encouraging, and equipping your clients to also raise their level of corporate behavior,
mm,
meaning they are also demonstrating proper cyber hygiene on their own and by
mm,
virtue of their relationship with their MSP.
mm,
Then both parties should enjoy what I call managed services immunity, which is this idea that is now circulating in a few states here in the U.S.,
mm,
but I suspect it's going to catch on globally very quickly. But it's the concept that there is a benefit to adopting proper cyber hygiene to counteract the not draconian, but certainly the very oppressive amount of regulation that we've been witnessing for the last probably 10 years on cyber attack
mm,
after action, right? So what do you do after you've been attacked, successfully or not, by
mm,
a cyber threat actor? Well, you have data breach notification rules, right? Starting in GDPR all throughout Europe, you had that as a base level of this is what you do if you are attacked. And then you have potential civil penalties, civil fines, private rights of action. Did my MSP do everything they were supposed to protect me? All of this driven, of course, by whether the insurance company is going to cover a claim or disclaim.
mm,
And so I think this concept of managed services immunity is going to fit into your description of the MSP and the client rising at a commensurate level as standards evolve and grow. There has to be an upside. There has to be a positive to counteract the negative of all the obligation that rests on the MSP and customer. There has to be an outlet,
mm,
um, which will allow what you said to happen. It'll
mm,
allow them to go into other vertical markets, perhaps higher levels of compliance. But again, back to that symbiotic
mm,
relationship.
mm, mm, mm. And so I suppose, the question is that if we're going to set that, if as an industry we're going out to set that basic level of cyber hygiene. I mean, I suppose there are a couple of questions on that. The first one of that is this a concept that is purely just for bigger MSPs? Is this just like, or is this something that even the really small MSPs could do with their customers? Because I know that, we talk again, you talk to a lot of people that certainly smaller MSPs, there's a, I mean, there is a fear that you have to take every customer. You can't go. You can't just take. You can't just pick what you see as the right customer. But as you mature, obviously, you can be more picky, and you can be more. You can be more adamant about those basic levels that you set. But really, should this be something that is open to small MSPs as well as large MSPs?
Pete, I believe it has to be available to even the smallest of MSPs and their customers. And and here's, I used to be of the opinion that the MSP, any size MSP, should be very discriminating about the type of customers that they take on, and that they should fire
Mm.
non-compliant,
Mm.
non-responsive clients who say, for example, I refuse to back up my data. I refuse to use multi-factor authentication. I refuse to turn on EDR, pay for
Mm.
EDR
Mm.
technology in my company, and many other examples. Um, and I think that there's a fair amount of MSPs in your community and in many other communities throughout the world who would agree with that. Like they're
Mm.
actively trying to differentiate the compliant, not in the same word that definition that you and I've been describing for the
Mm.
last segment, but are they responsive? Are they following our direction? Is what I mean. Are they compliant with our wishes and our guidance? And I think the further we get to the idea that even the smallest of organization has a role to play in critical infrastructure protection, we will soon find out that we cannot afford to fire those clients and leave them at the hands of a break fix company.
Mm.
Um, I think that we're going to have to do I think the MSP must protect themselves contractually through insurance and also through having the ability to demonstrate their own compliance, but they have to be able to articulate to a potential regulator, these are my compliant, safe customers.
Mm.
These are my non-compliant, non-safe
Mm.
customers. And I think that that's going to have to be a role that the MSPs embrace. And again, that's a discussion over a pint or two, because that's a larger public policy
Mm.
conversation we have not even begun to seriously have yet.
Yeah, yeah. That's we're racking up the pints here, I have to say.
Yeah,
But um,
thirsty business.
yeah. So uh, I think so. Yeah, that concept there that you just mentioned, that you would have to almost like somehow ring fence customers that aren't compliant and customers that are compliant. This is, from your own kind of from your own kind of insurance basis, to cover, literally to cover your own backside, to put it bluntly. Um, is the does is this going to lead to a stage where you somehow, any customers that you have that don't meet that specific, I suppose, baseline, have to be almost like kind of sandboxed somewhere and kept? You have to run them on separate systems from the clients that are. That sounds like it's potentially coming into a bit of a minefield, isn't it?
I agree with you completely that it would be perilous,
Mm.
but I think necessary. And I'll give you
Mm.
one good example. There is one litigation taking place now in the state of California amongst a customer who is a law firm
Right.
suing what they believe is their MSP. Now, this is a slightly different situation, but it shows the importance of having the MSP and their client, all types of clients under that MSP's control and
Mm.
management,
Mm.
have a very firm understanding of who they are. The
Mm.
client who is refusing to have data backed up, EDR, passwords
Mm.
managed, multi-factor turned on, etc. If they refuse all of those things, they cannot operate under the assumption that they are a protected cyber hygienic organization.
Of course not. No.
And that brings up far it brings up so many other questions and issues, such as how do you demonstrate that? How do you
Mm.
get that communication down from the MSP? Does the MSP know? Are
Mm.
they aware enough to understand that that is a non-compliant customer? And and then how do you tell an insurance company that? And how do you
Mm.
tell
Yeah.
a banking regulator or a whatever their regulatory scheme is that they fall under? These are big issues, Pete, and we are trying to address them in somewhat of a
Mm,
chronological or logical order, but that is the future I think we are marching right now
mm.
into, and we'll see how it ends up.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that would be, it seems like that's a logical step, but it also showing quite as an industry and as bodies involved within that sort of regulation and compliance of our industry. It is, we've still got a long way to go, and it's almost like every stone you turn, there's another one underneath that you've got that brings up a whole load more issues that you've got to kind of challenge with.
You know, we're not without some markers. We're not, the insurance industry, and it's dealing with. It might be slightly different in the UK, but certainly here and in Canada, if you are an uninsured driver,
Mm,
well, you have risk. You
mm,
are at risk yourself, and you are at risk to others if you are involved in an auto accident. And there are regulatory rules in place to deal with that. The managed services concept plays nicely. The managed services immunity concept plays nicely into this potential near future of ours, where we're having to demonstrate who is compliant, who isn't compliant, who is covered by this immunity, and who is not covered by the immunity, because we are going to have to treat those entities very differently
mm,
in
mm,
litigation, in insurance, in fines and liability. All of that's going to have to be partitioned, just not just for the sake of the MSP, but for the sake of others who need to understand very quickly the cyber compliance status of any given organization
mm,
very quickly.
mm,
And you know,
mm,
again,
mm,
very deep issues
mm,
for a,
mm,
uh
mm.
early
Uh,
morning.
so let's, yeah, yeah. Sorry about that.
No, no worries.
So let's kind of I'd like to try and round the conversation off, but let's try and round it with some kind of slightly more sort of solid issues that we feel we can kind of like we can address within a matter of a few minutes. I suppose the first one being, without this becoming, without being you thinking that I'm trying to drag you down a product cell. What are the what do you what really are the sort of, I suppose, what's that basic level of tool stack that MSPs should be deploying to ensure that basic level of hygiene?
Well, I mean, you could take the enable line card, and
Mm,
you could, starting with the fundamentals of having a solid RMM, covering the objects and the devices that you need
mm,
according to the practice area that you find yourself in. So having an RMM, having a strongly compatible ticketing system, performing backup
mm,
regularly, backup, testing and restoration, safeguarding that data, air gapping that data,
mm,
EDR, multi-factor authentication, password management. Those core technologies today are what I would consider minimal table stakes for MSPs to practice internally, for them to even achieve something like a cyber
mm,
verify level 1 or level 2 with our organization. All of those things must be present inside the MSP organization. We're not talking about delivered to their customer.
mm,
Now talking about what they should deliver to their customers to keep those entities in a compliant state. The same applies. You may have the need for other tools depending on the industry you find yourself in, but that you're going to take that on a case by case basis.
mm,
And those tools, it's not just the presence of those tools, but you have to have a keen understanding of how they work, how they interoperate, how you use them in the delivery of your service,
mm,
and be able to prove and evidence all of those component steps of your service delivery process. And that involves policy documents, that involves a fair amount of what I hope all MSPs are marching towards today, which is proper internal documentation,
mm,
having an information security policy, having a backup or a data handling policy, and so on. And putting all of those things together is what we would look at when we are evaluating and testing an MSP for certification. And then that is consequently also what the MSP should be demonstrating downstream to their customers if they want that particular customer to be able to demonstrate compliance or proper cyber hygiene. So I think if they look at the Enable menu of products and they're using them in that way, they're on the right path.
And I suppose final question is because we are still in a sort of a rapid rate of change within the regulation and compliance. It is just like I mean it's almost I wouldn't say changing on a daily basis, but there are issues coming up that will drive that change on an almost daily basis. How can MSPs effectively keep up with where they need to be in terms of an understanding of how the regulations are changing and how it impacts them?
Well, certainly we are trying to produce a steady volume of what I would consider regulatory types of guidance based on what we are hearing, and trying our best to synthesize on a global basis what we believe to be credible discussions and movements, whether it's knowing that the Australians are going to move in the next 2 years on banning ransomware payments, right? We know this from the highest levels, so you don't have to peer into a crystal ball to figure that out, and to plan. If you're in the Australian managed services market, you should be planning for the future where ransomware payments are no longer available to you or your clients. But to your question specifically, I think that if you are following proper MSP behavior, and our standard that we published in 2004, called the Unified Certification Standard for Cloud and Managed Service Providers. It's public, it's online. You can look at that and follow that on your own. You don't have to get certified by us to be doing that work on your own, and every MSP should. And if you do that, you would be in a very good position to pivot to UK Cyber Essentials if you're in the UK, to PIPEDA in Canada, to PAPIA in South Africa, to ISO 27001, to SOC 2 or CMMC, or whatever framework that you are contending with. If you follow our industry's best practice, you are compliant already with those other frameworks. And that would be the best guidance I could give, because then they're not trying to figure out who published this latest standard, because that's our job, is to make sure our standard reflects the larger regulatory environment.
Yeah, which is perfect. That's a perfect way to wrap it up, because it brings it back to this concept of like, just if you set a highest common denominator, if you set that basic level, then you know you're compliant across the board, or it's a relatively easy step to ensure that you are compliant across the board. Yes. Charles, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I apart from anything else, I look forward to cashing in on the beers. So
absolutely a privilege and an honor to speak with you, Pete.
Okay, take care.